You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and now it's time for the Paranormal Peep Show.
Hi, welcome to the Paranormal Peep Show with myself, Neil Ward, and joining me this month in lieu of Andy Chaplin, who's a very busy man with his tuned-in events, is once again our friend and occasional co-host, Ben Emlyn-Jones. Hi, Ben, how are you?
Hi, Neil. I'm very well, thanks. It's good to be back on the show. These always very interesting, these programs. It's always nice when I can step in to add these shoes and help you out.
Good. Thanks for joining us, Ben. So you've been quite busy on your own shows and live streams and things like that. You had a few technical issues with YouTube the other night, didn't you, in your live stream?
Unfortunately, yes, I had another issue where YouTube decided to stop my live stream. They've done this several times, they delete videos and things like this, and it's very, very annoying. It was for a completely false situation as well. They accused me of, they said they detected copyrighted material, although I was actually broadcasting something that's in the public domain. So, but you can't really appeal, they just stopped the live stream. So what I did was I went over to Rumble and I carried it on there, where you don't have all that kind of aggravation. So, I pay a lot of homage to the alt techies who create these websites, Minds, Gab, Getter, Rumble, BitChute, etc. So, it ended up being a very good live stream. It was great fun.
And what was the subject to the live stream, for those that don't know?
We were talking about Tucker Carlson's historical interview with President Putin of Russia. It's really quite an extraordinary thing. So I did a deep dive into all the all the content, all over 2 hours, 7 minutes of it. So quite something.
So what was your opinion of the thing in general?
I think it's very, very good. I mean, I think the war in Ukraine over the last couple of years, during the time it was on, was portrayed in a very one-sided way in the Western media. We were told that Ukraine was good and Russia was bad, and that was it. And I think that's false. I think there's another side to the story, and I'm glad it's now been told on such a high-profile platform, and it's been seen by so many people. So hopefully that'll make people think again. It wasn't perfect. I mean, it's possible Tucker will go back and do more, but I was hoping, hope above hope, I was hoping that, Putin would come clean about the UFOs. Because I know he knows.
Yeah.
I was egging Tucker on, go and ask him about the UFOs, because Tucker Carlson is very, very open-minded about UFOs. He's always talking about it, so he understands these things. But I was hoping he'd ask President Putin about that, but he didn't. So,
I would imagine, because he was a Fox News guy, Tucker Carlson, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was sacked by them, even though he's a popular host. So.
Yeah. I guess he perhaps wouldn't be able to do this Putin interview if he was still an employee of Fox News, I'd imagine.
Well, I think when he actually got sacked, a lot of people said, this is it could be a great opportunity for him rather than a disaster. And indeed, he set up his Tucker Carlson News Network, and he does his own things now. And this is a very impressive development on his part, I think. But I just said I want him to go back and ask Putin about the UFOs, and maybe some other things as well, because he does know about it. Carlson, he's always talking about UFOs.
It would be interesting to see that development if that happens. So good luck to him if he can do that. And I, for one, would be watching it definitely if that happens. So, without further ado, I think we best bring on our guest, who we have had before on the Paranormal Peep Show. He joined us a few months ago, and with one of these particular subjects, there's always a lot more to explore, and it can't be done necessarily in one whole 2-hour show because there's a lot more to be said. So we welcome back to the Paranormal Peep Show, Randy. Randy, welcome back.
Neil, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. And hello to you too, Ben. Good to see you again. It's been about a few years, I think.
Yes, we was Apollo Detectives, I think, when we first interacted.
Yeah, that was with Blue Earth thing.
Yes,
that's it.
That was very interesting.
Yeah. So Randy Walsh joins us from Canada, and he spoke to us a few months back on his book, The Apollo Moon Hoax Hidden in Plain Sight. And I think we covered a lot of part one, where we talked about the F1 engines on the Saturn V rocket, the navigation problems, possibly that might have had on the Apollo 13 mission. And your actual show prompted a bit of to and fro with some of the on our YouTube channel that watched it. And they've done their own investigations into the Apollo things. They've looked at it, and it was someone from your old country, from Ireland, of all places. And they've been doing a look at what they consider as a new calculation of the Earth to the Moon. Shanina, I think her name is. If hopefully I've got your name right. Apologies if I haven't. But she's produced this video on how she's recalculated the distance and makes it, quite surprisingly, to about a 2,000-mile range approximately from the Earth to the Moon. Now, I sent those details to you. Because you know about navigation and things like that, and you've looked at the Apollo 13 stuff, Randy. Is there anything wrong with that, or do you think there's problems with that calculation she's done?
Yeah. So first of all, I did a cursory look at her a couple of her videos, and first of all, I was struck by her detail and by her mathematical abilities, and so nobody can dispute that. In terms of her overall theory, I mean, I really have to look into this further. Now, I've been out of school for 45 years, so I don't always trust my own math here either, to be honest with you. But I'm also very careful not to criticize the work of someone else's, even if I don't necessarily agree with them. It's an interesting theory. There's no doubt about it. If I could offer her some constructive criticism, I would leave the Apollo missions out of it. She's only going to further discredit herself by that, because I've noticed that from the comments that she's getting, that people are jumping on the Apollo moon mission aspect. They're ignoring her actual theory, right? So to give herself a little bit more credibility, so far I haven't seen anything, to be honest with you, that, in my opinion, validates her theory. But you know what? In the last 20 years, I've learned not to shut the door. And especially in the last 4 years, where there seems to be an enormous rise in consciousness overall among the human race, given what we've all went through with the, and I'll use some code words here. I know this is going on YouTube. So, given, the, how shall I say, the tyranny in the last 4 years, if I can put it that way. So I've learned not to discount outright anyone's theory. I would like to know more about it. I'm hoping maybe she puts a book out where I can actually sit down, read the book, and then study it and make notes and go from there. Intriguing it is. The one concern I do have with her is that she's going to be eventually categorized within the flat earth theory crowd. And that's a major psyop in and of itself. So if I were her, I'd be a little bit careful about that. But, it sounds intriguing. I think you should have her on. I think she should have her own platform first, and then we could take it from there. So I'm kind of not convinced right now. But definitely I will keep my mind open, because I mean, in terms of the navigation aspect, I mean, as you said, I've looked into this, and I think it's important to, when we're talking about the Apollo missions, which she did, and she starts off her video by saying that they really go to the moon type of thing, and automatically she's now diverting people away from her own work. I like to argue or to debate and discuss that the Apollo missions were faked, and I like to prove it within the official framework, because that's how you actually convince people. It's not about winning people over. It's just getting them to look at this themselves and say, well, the moon is 250,000 miles away. Here is the method that they used to get there. And I think I successfully proved or made a very good case that with technology 50 years ago, let alone today, it's just impossible to do it within the official framework. So that's kind of the angle I like to work from. If it turns out that she's right, well, then that just validates my theory even more. So, but I would like to look at her work a little bit more before I actually, say yay or nay on this.
Yeah, that sounds a fair assessment, to be honest. The other interesting thing is that I'm not absolutely sure how they calculated originally the distance of the Earth to the moon, and then they got it wrong and they had to recalculate. They got it wrong by a few thousand miles or something. So I think at the time of Kubrick's film, where 2001, no, not 2001, The Shining, they had the room 238, which a lot of people allude to as being the distance of the Earth to the moon, 238,000 miles. And it was around about that time that everyone agreed or thought it was 238,000 miles. But then later on, they did some further calculations and came up with some other distance, which I'm not even sure. But do you know how they work those calculations out? Is it some sort of parallax thing, different points of the Earth pointing? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, let's face it. They had pretty good mathematical capabilities going back hundreds of years, even thousands of years. And they were, even going back hundreds of years, they were getting very precise. I mean, Isaac Newton, for example, he was very, not exactly on, but they had some mathematical ability. They had techniques that they used, basic old math, trigonometry, geometry, to figure out a rough estimate of the moon. But now we're talking about today. And as you said earlier, there has been different distances. And that actually is something I mentioned I think in my first book, I mentioned that. And when it comes down to navigating from here to the Earth, to the moon, now whether it's a manned mission or an unmanned mission, you would think that they would be precise right down to the last inch. And I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that, even with today's technology, right? Given that the moon, moves it doesn't necessarily move its position, but it's closer at some points as further away. So you need to be precise. You need to have that actual distance in real time. So my answer to you is that, well, they can't figure it out, and they're supposed to have, the high IQ and the mathematics and the supercomputers to do it. I certainly wouldn't know how to. But what I do know is that they're not as precise as they let on. And now, if they're not as precise as they let on, that raises another question, because if you're going to navigate 250,000 miles, you need to be precise. There is no margin for error, especially when it comes from manned missions, given the limited propellant that they have on board, because they'd have to be constantly making corrections. And we all know that every effort was made, and I'm, again, speaking within the official version, every effort was made to keep weight down as much as possible. That also included propellant. If you were to fly an airplane like that, you'd kill a lot of passengers.
And supposedly they got more accurate readings now, so they claim they landed the laser reflectors there with the first mission by putting laser reflectors, and presumably the idea is that they would send a signal back to Earth and they could measure the distance very accurately back in 1969. And yet, in 1980 or 81, whenever the Kubrick film came out, they were saying the Earth was 238,000 miles from the moon. And you would think that if they've got these lasers bouncing, they would be able to work out the distance with the lasers back in 69. So we should have had it accurately back in 69 from the word go, I would have thought.
Well, I think you just answered your own question. You would think, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly right. And the other thing is that for those out there that don't realize this, both the Soviets at the time, the Soviet Union, and the Americans were bouncing lasers off the moon as early as 1961, 62. And they were getting fairly good results and some good accuracy as well. So the argument that the Apollo missions happened because they put laser reflectors on the moon is really a fallacy. It just doesn't hold up, because the areas that they target those lasers happen to be the areas on the moon where the most reflective. And that just happens to be the areas where they landed all 6 missions, supposedly landed all 6 missions. So it's really, and what amazes me is that these geologists and work for established institutions haven't really figured this part out yet. And yet we as lay people have. So, again, this is in the book for people who are really interested in diving into it. But and the other thing also with laser reflectors is that they've been placed there. They can be easily placed there by unmanned missions, which the Soviets have done, and so have the Americans. So it's just another fallacy for me.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is, I think it's on Mythbusters where they show a thing supposedly proving the Apollo missions are real. They go to some observatory type of place where they say, right, we're going to send a laser beam to the Apollo 11 landing site, and we're going to get a signal back. But as you say, if that's the reflective area anyway, being across the equator of the moon, because that's the point that's furthest out, so it's being struck by the sun the most at certain points anyway, you're going to get some sort of reflection back anyway. So, I mean, it's such a tiny, tiny little 2-foot across little box that they got to somehow hit from presumably a wide beam by the time it is. It's going to be hitting all sorts of things, moon rock, dust, and all sorts of things. So you're going to get lots of things bouncing back. So I think you're going to get a scattered reflection as such coming back. What do you know about that, Ben?
So no, that's a good point. And I haven't done a lot of research in that because there's other areas to research that, you couldn't research every aspect of the Apollo missions. You need a team of about 120 people to do that if you're taking the evidence back. But just to your point there regarding the lasers, I mean, 50 years ago, you had quite a dispersal. When you fired the laser, it would expand. It would probably hit about maybe a 2 square mile, 2 or 3 square mile area of the moon. They've refined that. They've managed to refine that with technology. And you don't need a reflector to bounce it back. You can refine it. And, I don't know how refined it is, but technology, when it comes to lasers, has been refined, and they've been able to narrow that dispersal pattern as it gets to the moon. So you're getting a pretty good, I would say, accuracy. But then again, there seems to be discrepancies in the distance of the moon. So your guess is as good as mine in terms of what's really going on here. There's a lot of disinformation and misinformation when it comes to this. And there's a lot of people that, look into this and are thrown off. That's why I cautioned the individual from Ireland that you were mentioning. It's just, continue along with her work. That would be my suggestion, but leave the Apollo moons out. Leave that up to us and just focus on your own work.
I mean, that's to say that she could also look into the Apollo thing on her own thing and presumably doubt it, whatever she wants to do. But, you can... presumably, that's right. It's a difficult line to tread. You got to publish certain things in certain quarters and certain things in other areas. And if you clam it all together, you're going to get you might rattle quite a few cages when you want to actually be heard above the rattle.
This is the thing. I mean, I talk about the Apollo moon missions. You talk about the Apollo moon missions. Now we have this individual in Ireland and her work, and she's talking about her work, but now she's mixing it in with another controversial subject. One's enough, right? Just stick with the one and keep it for another video, right? So that's my friendly advice to her.
Ben, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'm not actually familiar with this lady. I don't know. I haven't actually seen her comments and such like that. I know a lot of people have a lot to say about this particular issue. I've not heard anyone say anything that successfully counters the points we made. As far as the retroreflector goes from Apollo 11, this is wrongly presented as proof. I've seen many, many examples, including amateur radio hams, reflecting all kinds of wavelengths, amplitudes, and frequencies transmissions off the moon, off the lunar surface generally. Indeed, one guy showed off how he used his shortwave radio to get a radio echo off the moon, and it's really he actually could work out just basically on the time it took for the signal to go there and come back exactly how far away the moon was. The moon has a very regular orbit. It's one of the most non-eccentric, whatever the opposite of eccentric is, orbits in the entire solar system. It's literally, it's almost like a completely circular orbit. It varies very, very little indeed. And once you know where it is at one point, you can guess pretty much any time in the future where it is going to be and how far it's going to be, away it's going to be, pretty much precisely, just by simply working it out. So the idea that the Apollo missions had to happen because we know how far away the moon is, and we know exactly how far it is because of the using laser or radio or any other form of electromagnetic radiation, is simply false. And it's something they keep coming back to. I think they may be appealing to the uninitiated to try and deflect their interest away before they get too deep. I think a lot of these skeptic documentaries are doing that. A lot of them are very transparently false from our position, because they're not aimed at us. They're not aimed at changing our minds. They're aimed at deflecting interest away by people who are new to the subject and don't know. And so that doesn't surprise me at all. But anyway, I wish her luck. If she can, she may be able to work something out. Good.
Right, just hold it there, guys. I just need to let the dog out because
Okay,
she's begging to go out the loop.
Oh.
Carry on chatting, and I'll come back in a few minutes. Bear with me. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So the whole issue. I mean, the whole issue, I suppose, is in your book, Randy, isn't it? Because you wrote a book.
Yeah. So just wanted to expand on the point you made there, and I'm not saying that this is my theory, but there has been some video footage of the moon that has come out in the last few years, and these are, of course, I would say unofficial sources, but nonetheless, they're putting their credibility in the line, and there seems to be some anomaly when it comes to looking at the surface of the moon. So there have people are seeing things that shouldn't be there, considering that it doesn't have an atmosphere. And they've even gone as far as to say, is there some kind of a barrier? Now, whether that barrier is from advanced technology, we don't know. Is that a barrier that's just, a natural phenomenon? That also could affect lasers, and it could affect in terms of getting proper distances. But it is another intriguing field to take into consideration, because there seems to be a lot of really new new information in terms of challenging the consensus reality.
Definitely. Can I ask what exactly do you mean by a barrier?
Yeah. So I was actually on a phone-in show last week, and an interview. It was live, and we had a phone-in call session. And this individual had called in, and he asked me, was I aware of the fact that some of the, when you point a telescope at the moon, and a lot of really, there's a lot of very competent amateur astronomers out there, and they point their equipment at the moon, and then they videotape it. And they've noticed occasionally that there seems to be some kind of vertical line that goes across their camera. Now, whether that's a video camera anomaly or atmospheric anomaly, it could be any number of things, but they seem to have ruled a lot of that out. And so it comes back to, is there some kind of barrier in the between here and the moon? Now, this barrier would obviously be somewhat transparent, right? It's not like a physical barrier. So they're getting into some very deep rabbit holes here, and I admit this is a deep rabbit hole, not one that I really want to go into in terms of in-depth study, at least right now. But there does seem to be circumstantial evidence, and I say that, let me emphasize that word, circumstantial evidence, that there is some, occasionally there is a distortion in terms of the video footage of the moon, where you have this vertical line going across, and you can almost like see some transparency, and you see other things going off, like you see lights going off on the moon. And these are not, people can brush it off and say, well, maybe it's a meteorite strike or multiple strikes. But there does seem to be, and the other thing is there does seem to be areas on the moon. I think it's in the south, from our vantage point, I'll use our sense of direction because they're the opposite when you're on the moon, but the southeast quadrant, there seems to be some activity some buildup of heat. So there's some strange things going on the moon. A lot of things coming out now in the last 2 or 3 years. So really, you know what? You can't discount anything. And as I said earlier, I like to argue the point within the official version, but there's another layer to add on to this when it comes to the moon. That's really what I'm getting at here.
So I've got an image in mind that what it could be. I mean, based on what you've described, I mean, I've never heard of this before. It's as if it's some kind of a false image, a holographic image or something. Yeah, that's been projected to hide something underneath, like in the book Atlas Shrugged, where there's a town and it can't be seen from the air because it has from the air it looks like there's just nothing there below you except normal landscape, and it turns out that's actually it's actually a projected image into the sky.
Yes, and it could very well be a natural phenomenon, right? But it's just interesting that it's only been noticed now more so in the last, I would say, last 10 years. And that, I mean, that's intriguing in and of itself, given that technology, when it comes to photographic video technology, is a lot more advanced than it's ever been. So maybe the camera's picking up something. Maybe it's just a natural phenomenon. I don't know. But that's that's not what I'm reporting. That's what astronomers, amateur astronomers are reporting. So,
I know there's several people. Obviously, the moon has the dark side of the moon, or the far side, to give it its proper name, which always faces away from the Earth, which is invisible. It's actually one of the few places in the entire universe which is completely invisible to the Earth from the Earth's surface, apart for a reason other than sheer distance. And it's, of course, it's right next door to us, so it's our closest neighbour. And in fact, there's two people I can name, Carl Wolf and Donna Hare, who actually worked for NASA processing photographs, and they both report that that NASA were taking pictures of artificial objects on that particular area away from the moon. They were built quite openly on the surface, which they could do so because no one could see it from the Earth's surface. And NASA were basically touching them up. They were getting artists with paintbrushes to touch up the photographs for publishing them. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but both these people reported it. And so I wonder if it could be that there is something on the side facing the Earth, which of course would be spotted immediately if it were just there. And maybe someone wants to try and hide it in some way, and maybe the technology exists to put some kind of holographic image above it. I mean, again, I'm speculating like you are, but I think that's very interesting, Randy. I've never heard of that before, so thank you.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize, and I'm glad you said that, Ben. I just want to emphasize that, of course, we are speculating. I don't need all the physicists or the engineers like Steve jumping in and say, you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, prove the math. No, I'm not a physicist or a scientist, so I'm just speculating there, Steve. Take it easy, right? But there is, and I have read this, and I'll finish on this point when it comes to the subject, but I have read in numerous books, and I don't have a source for those books, but I have read over the years, actual physicists talking about the moon in terms of its size and its mass, and it being, for its size and its mass, it shouldn't be in the orbit it's in around Earth. I have read that. That's not me saying that out there. That's what I have read. And I don't have a source for that, so don't come at me, but that is what I have read. And it's interesting because there may be some circumstantial evidence or intriguing evidence to back that up, or at least to give it a little bit of validity, in the sense that when NASA fires, when they crash into the, which they purposely done, they crashed some, spent rockets into the surface of the moon. I mean, they've come back and actually used the phrase, it rang like a bell for an hour. So that kind of gives it a little bit of validity.
Definitely. I mean, I'm interested that the density of the moon is very low considering its geology, which is not unlike the Earth, but its density is actually very low, indicating that there are. It's either the subsurface geology is very different, which is unlikely, or there are large cavities within the moon, caves and other spaces. These could be either natural, or they may form naturally, or they may be artificial. Of course, there are natural caves under the Earth as well. But some people say, well, are they artificial? Are they built by a non-human intelligence, or maybe a very advanced human intelligence in the distant past, or something like that? That we don't know, because no one knows what they are. No one's ever been there to find out. No one's well, obviously,
the Anunnaki, right?
well, they are the ancient
Speculation, folks.
I know, but ancient mythology across the world is replete with stories of non-human intelligences interacting with us quite openly. I mean, Eric von Daniken's written a lot about this. Other people, And
again, like I'm not saying like I'm laughing a little bit, but at the same time, we can't discount anything anymore. I mean, okay, yes, we need to see evidence, and we need to see it in front of us. So speculation is good, and I've speculated in my books, and I speculated in my recent book, which I'll talk about after. But just put out a third book, and speculation is okay. But don't come out and say this and this and this unless you can actually prove it. Now, I can't prove what I just said in terms of the moon and the anomalies on the moon, but definitely, how do you look into something when you talk about it? And then maybe you speculate and you come up with speculate about it, and then you come up with a hypothesis, right? And then it leads to a theory, and then you go from there. So that's basically all I'm doing is that nothing can be discounted when it comes to the Earth and Moon, and especially our own history, which I do think a lot of is being falsified. Another area for another day, folks, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, because I was just thinking, as you're talking about Inside the Moon, the Jules Verne film story, First Men in the Moon, where there's a film version of it where these two Victorian travellers, I think in the film they had a lady with them, but I don't know whether they wrote that in for the film of the 60s, and Lionel Jeffries, I think, was the actor who was the scientist inventor, and they devised this anti-gravity paint or something. They painted on the side of their ship, and it allowed them to float upwards out of the rain.
They called it.
Yeah, that's it.
He's called Carver, the scientist.
And they discovered these internal caverns like Ben was talking about, but they had these creatures in there. Ray Harryhausen, I think, did the animation. Great film. I loved it. But it also again reminds me of the remote viewer Ingo Swann, who worked for the CIA, but also worked for other people undisclosed. He gave them perhaps pseudonyms. He didn't want to kind of disclose exactly who they were. Where he was asked to remote view some coordinates, and he realized that the coordinates he was remote viewing happened to be on the moon. And he said, I'm on the moon, and he could sort of see mountains or craters and things like that. But he said, but there's people here. He said, but they're naked, but they were humanoids. He said, but they weren't humans. They were humanoids. In other words, they had a head, 2 arms, 2 legs, and that's perhaps as far as the similarity went. They must have looked very alien-like. But for some reason, they were naked. They did, or lots of reports of UFO occupants tend to talk about very close-fitting bodysuits, so they could have had that. He may have not seen it quite fully. But they seem to be mining the moon in some way. It's presumably helium-3 they've discovered on the moon, but they seem to be harvesting the moon for mineral resources in some way. And once he said they're aware of me, though. Somehow they're aware of his consciousness being shot to the moon in some way. And he said they're sort of coming towards me. They're aware that I'm here. So the guy that was sort of gave him the coordinates, who was in charge of this research project, basically said, get out of there, come back now. And he speculated. He said, I don't know who this guy was that engaged him. He called him Mr. Axelrod. And he paid him something like $10,000 cash per day, which was a very, very large sum of money back in 1975 or whenever he was asked to do this. And he wondered if this Mr. Axelrod was himself an alien, and he wanted to test out how far humans in their psychic development had got. In other words, could they, with their psychic abilities, discover that Mr. Axelrod and his buddies are doing something surreptitiously on the moon that they didn't want them to know about? So he obviously heard about Ingo Swann, thought, right, I need to see how far this guy can penetrate our defense systems. A bit like engaging a computer hacker to hack into your own company's web stuff to see if your defenses are good enough to withstand it. And this is the kind of analogy that was used. So he was penetrating the moon's defenses with his psychic abilities. He got there and they were aware of him. So after that, he was, told not to do it again, kind of thing. But it makes me wonder if there are people on the moon. You know, there's a website, I think I let you know about it the other night, Ben, called Allies of Humanity. And it's this guy who, the last 30 years, he's kind of supposedly had channel communication from this, I think he would call it an alien beings or something like that.
Marshall Vian Summers.
That's the guy, yeah.
I've read one of his books.
Yeah, so basically, he to summarize it then, and Ben, you're aware of it then, so he's received communications from these beings who have parked themselves somewhere within close vicinity to the Earth, and I speculated it to myself that maybe they were on the moon, perhaps on the backside of the moon, because we talked about bases on the backside of the moon. Does this all tie up with other sources of information about backsides of the moon bases, that kind of stuff? But apparently they won't say where they are because they don't want themselves to be discovered. But what they're doing, apparently, these other aliens, they're monitoring the comings and goings of all these other ET races coming to Earth, and they're reporting through to this Marshall Summers, the recipient of the messages, exactly what's going on. And they're sort of saying that these are the bad guys that are coming in. They're trying to manipulate humanity. They're trying to genetically manipulate humanity so that they can put their people in to key positions on Earth within government, who in 30 years' time might look human, but in fact they're thinking alien, And so there's not going to be one laser gun fired in this takeover of Earth or humanity. They're going to do it in a stealth mission from within, rather like a virus might take over your body and mutate. And that's the kind of plan. And this is what Marshall Summers says in his writings, the Allies of Humanity. So it's a website that if anyone wants to go and check out, it's called the Allies of Humanity. It's worth looking into.
Yeah, it reminds me of that film They Live, about the
yes,
the aliens disguised as humans. You put special sunglasses on, you can see them. Yeah.
Now, in your second book, Randy, the Apollo Moon Hoax Hidden in Plain Sight Part 2, you talk about the founders of JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, for those that don't know what JPL is. Lots of space fans would definitely know what JPL is. But for those that don't, do you want to explain a bit about who JPL was, how they came about, and why you spoke about them in your book?
Sure. And is it okay? I just want to make a footnote to what you were just talking about.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I was, when I say, and I'm actually talking to the viewers out there, I wouldn't discount the possibility of remote viewers. There seems to be some science behind it. The fact that the CIA and military intelligence have been heavily involved in it, and they've been recruiting people over the last several decades. So they seem to give it a lot of validity. So for the naysayers out there, I would encourage you to look at that. But there was one person that came to mind when you were talking about that individual you just mentioned. His name is Nick Alger. Yeah, Eagles Swarm. It's Nick Alger. Nick Alger has been involved in military intelligence for decades. He too is a remote viewer, and he now has a channel on Rumble, and he talks a lot about this. And he has made some uncanny predictions in the last 3 to 4 years that I have been watching him that have actually come to fruition, have actually come true. And it's interesting because you really got my interest when you said that, you know, when he was the Ingan Swan was remote view and he felt like somebody was looking back. That is exactly what Nick Alger's experience was when he was asked to remote view the moon. And he felt that he was intruding, and he got scared, and he stopped it because they were looking back at him.
Right. Could be the very same beings, perhaps.
Yeah, he talked about that. So definitely that's an area that, you know, some people will laugh at, but hey, you know what? As they say, truth is stranger than fiction. So we'll leave that open for now.
Watch this space, pardon the pun.
Yes.
Yeah. So JPL, you talked about JPL in your second book.
So I came across, when I was writing, when I was looking into researching book 2, I came across, just by accident, several books on Jack Parsons. And Jack Parsons, for those of you who don't know, was an up-and-coming scientist back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Now, there's a lot of information to Jack Parsons that we can get out. We can talk about. But what really struck me with Jack Parsons is that, and before I get into that, for all of you who don't know, Jack Parsons' theories to this day were used, if you believe in the Apollo missions, were used in the Apollo missions in terms of whatever they got out of those missions. I mean, they never went to the moon, but they did get something out of the Saturn V rocket, and of course the space shuttle. And Jack Parsons' theories really are prevalent within the space shuttle technology more in terms of the solid fuel boosters that the space shuttle used. Now, Jack Parsons, it's really difficult to know where to start with him. So let me just give a little bit of history for Jack Parsons. And for those who don't know, Jack Parsons he actually had created, along with two other individuals at that time, two other scientists, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, and they named it. They named it Jet Propulsion Laboratory in part after Jack Parsons, since he thought of the idea. But as Marcus Allen kind of wondered, and I thought it was a very good point on his part, is it actually Jack Parsons Laboratory, but they changed it to Jet Propulsion Laboratory, right? And what makes Jack Parsons very interesting is there's a few layers to him. Number one, Jack Parsons had no formal education. He had nothing beyond grade 12 or high school. He had no university level education. And with that, he managed to develop theories that, as I just mentioned earlier, are still in use to this day by NASA. He literally, one day, at about 18 or 19 years old, he read a paper back then, and I think it was maybe 1930, 31, he read an article in the newspaper about rocket science, which was unheard of at that time. Rocket science was for Hollywood. It was out of the domain of the military. They weren't interested in it at that time. It was, it was a cartoon. It was entertainment. But he read an article that was actually published by a professor at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. He literally walked in. Just one day, this 19, 20-year-old walked into Caltech, searched down the professor, and told the professor he was really intrigued with his work. And the professor, of course, was busy with other work, but he was really intrigued with Jack Parsons at that time and his knowledge. And long story short, he sent them on to somebody else. And now, another long story short, Jack Parsons not only became a frequent visitor or guest, shall I say, at Caltech, he became a faculty member. And that's without any higher education. He was given his own lab to do his own experiments. And of course, the experiments involved limited explosions. So they had to move that offsite, and they funded his whole research in a desert and funded his lab there and gave him an entourage. And this is a man who basically walked in off the street, literally, right? Literally. And within a few years, he's not only a member of the faculty of Caltech, he has his own entourage, and he has negotiations going on with the U.S. military to develop propulsion systems for their weapons, because World War II is coming up, right? But here's the other thing that I think makes it even more intriguing. This is a man, and this is why we never hear about him a lot. They have a dedication to him once a year. They dedicate, they have a ceremony for him once a year at JPL. And it's always low key. It's never in the forefront. It's never out in the open. And NASA really shies away when it comes to talking about Jack Parsons, because Jack Parsons has another interesting background. Jack Parsons was a Satanist, and he was a devout follower of Alistair Crowley. And Alistair Crowley, for many of you out there will know, Alistair Crowley was very prominent in the political and entertainment scene back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s in Britain. And he had a lot of followers. And to give you some idea of the importance of Alistair Crowley is on the cover of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. And he's also, I believe that the guitarist for Led Zeppelin, his name escapes me right now. You'll know it. Oh yeah, the best. Isn't he the best? He owns, I think he owns one of the houses or one of the mansions that Alistair Crowley.
Yeah, I heard.
Moleskine House, yes, but it's right beside Loch Ness.
Yeah. So very interesting. And so when he was basically, and this is how I portrayed him in the book, he's a rocket scientist by day and an occultist by night. And that eventually led to his two worlds colliding, and it really came to his demise. But there's some other interesting aspects to Jack Parsons that people don't know about. And it turns out that Jack Parsons had a close connection to Wernher von Braun. And this was in the 1930s, before World War II. And I want to emphasize that point, before World War II. So now you have a scientist connected to Caltech and also to the FBI, because the FBI had run security checks on him because he's now involved in military weaponry. So he was involved in that. And then we find out that he's an occultist. There's lots of letters written between him and Alistair Crowley. They never physically met, but they had a close correspondence. But but he did meet Ron L. Hubbard, who went on to develop Scientology, to create the Church of Scientology. And we all know about the Church of Scientology and its influence with actors like Tom Hanks and Tom Cruise, and its influence in Hollywood and in politics. So that's the other side of Jack Parsons. And this explains in part why NASA is very shy about putting him out in front, when if it wasn't for Jack Parsons, you wouldn't have a space shuttle program. And the other thing is that Jack Parsons also, and this is a crucial point that I want to make, is Jack Parsons was constantly under the surveillance at the FBI. So what does that tell you? Well, if he's constantly under the surveillance of the FBI, then how is it that the FBI either didn't know or knew and were covering up the fact that he had a correspondence, not through letters, but through phone conversations with Wernher von Braun, not only before World War II, during World War II, and after World War II? One has to ask, what was that about? There's a lot more to Jack Parsons than we've been told. There's a lot more going on here. Very intriguing. And I only wrote one chapter. If I was to do that justice, it would be a whole book or maybe two. That's how intriguing a rabbit hole this is when it comes to talking about Jack Parsons.
I suspect with the fact that he was in communication with Wernher von Braun, and again, for listeners that don't know or viewers that don't know who Wernher von Braun is, he was the inventor of the war machines against Britain, which was the V1 and V2 rockets, basically that launched the Blitz against the Brits in World War II. So these rockets would fire off from Germany and basically crash over London or surrounding counties, some far afield as Birmingham as well. And after World War II was over, he, along with many other German scientists, were taken under a scheme operated by the US called Operation Paperclip, which was to bring in these German World War II scientists into the United States. They weren't tried as war criminals. They were kind of basically brushed that aside because they were too valuable to shut up in prison all day or even, shoot or whatever they would have done with these people. They actually harnessed what they could from them. And so Wernher von Braun was used basically to help set up NASA and went on to design the Saturn V rocket, which allegedly took people to the moon. And so his involvement with Jack Parsons pre-war and during the war, it must have been that the FBI must have learned a hell of a lot about Wernher von Braun through Jack Parsons, either surreptitiously or they just interrogate him. Who's this guy you're talking to? Tell us all about him. And they must have seen a lot of information. And presumably from that point on, they must have targeted Wernher von Braun as a person of interest to utilize at some point in the future, whenever that point of the war came. They definitely wanted him alive to bring in, I think. That sounds like the case.
I would agree with that. I think that's a very good, you raised a very good point. I have more questions though. And this has to be asked. Jack Parsons was killed in a very mysterious accident in 1952. He was only 37 years old. Is it possible, and this is just speculation on my part, but is it possible? Because when you look at the bigger picture, well, the FBI knew him. Now, the FBI had revoked his security clearance because of his involvement in the occult. But then he was allowed back in, but he was closely watched. But just put that aside for a second. Was Jack Parsons and the relationship between Jack Parsons and Wernher von Braun, was Wernher von Braun seeking information from Jack Parsons in terms of his own technology with the V2 rocket? In other words, was Wernher von Braun getting advice from Jack Parsons to build a weapon that was terrorizing Britain? Right? And that's just one aspect of it. That has to be asked. And if so, the FBI was fully informed of this, and the precursor to the CIA was involved in this, which I think was the OSS at the time. And of course, therefore, ergo the American government, right? And Britain would have to have known about this too. So you have to ask yourself, well, if that's the case, and again, this is just speculation on my part, if that's the case, then what exactly was World War II all about when you have the hierarchy, the government officials, scientists in both Britain and the United States aiding the enemy to build a technology to attack their own people?
Right? Yeah, it's almost like a way of testing out the technology.
Yeah, and that cannot be discounted. You cannot come back at me, anybody out there cannot come back and say, no, that's not true, because we don't know. But there is, again, circumstantial evidence that that's exactly what may have been going on. Because why else would he be in telephone conversations? In fact, Jack Parsons' partner at the time, his girlfriend, she used to talk about it. Oh, he's talking to that German. He's talking to that German in Germany before, during, and after World War II. And there's evidence that they did physically meet when Wernher von Braun was brought over, along with the other Nazi scientists. And that's, for me, that's a troubling development, because it paints NASA. Now NASA wasn't in existence before this happened. Of course, NASA came out in 1959, okay? But Jack Parsons' Jet Propulsion Laboratory is within NASA. It's basically under the purview of NASA. NASA celebrates its existence every year, but they're always reluctant to talk about Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons had many layers, many layers. Here's an uneducated person, just to recap, an uneducated person who solved a problem with the solid rocket boosters that went on for 700 years. Remember, solid rocket, say that 10 times. Solid fuel rockets have been around for 700 years. You know, you go back to the Benson era, right? They were used in war. And he had solved the problem of instability. There was a constant problem with solid fuel boosters. They were prone to blowing up. He solved that problem. Now, he didn't have the mathematical ability to solve the problem, but what he did is he knew what the problem was, and he told his colleagues who did have the higher functioning math, like differential calculus, what the problem was, and they came up with the equations and fixed it. So, here's an individual, Jack Parsons, who didn't have the ability for differential calculus, but yet he was a seer. And he came out, he discovered the problem, and then told them what the problem was, and then the mathematicians fixed it. That's a very good example of the contribution that many can make and that he himself has made. And of course, then there's his work with the occult. And it turns out now that he was actually experimenting with explosives. And this isn't me saying this is the information that I've read on him, that he was actually trying to open a portal to another dimension and release a gateway to have entities come forward. And there is some speculation and some evidence that that's exactly what happened one night, a few weeks before he was actually killed, when he was experimenting and there was an explosion. And he wasn't hurt at that time, but the whole house shook. And there was a couple of witnesses that described what they saw as banshees that were produced from that explosion. Now, that could have been another, a trick in the eye, a phenomenon, but there seemed to be something very serious happened. And one of the individuals, I think his name was Ed Powers, who he was working closely with, distanced himself from Jack Jack Parsons, he distanced himself after that. He had nothing more to do with him. He was that scared. So something happened that night as a result of Jack Parsons' experiments that scared away his own very close friend and colleague. Something very serious happened. It was only a few weeks later that he was supposedly killed in an accident. I don't know if it was an accident. I speculate there may be more behind it, but I also speculate that maybe they wanted him out of the way because he was the real genius, if I can put it that way, behind the technology that NASA is using today, not Wernher von Braun. That's just my own speculation, but I could be wrong. And, I'm not saying Wernher von Braun he was no slouch either. He certainly had made some contributions, but he had a conscience too, I found out later that he wasn't really sure if he wanted to be involved in the Apollo program. He knew about the lie. He knew that he knew as early as 1962 that they weren't going to land on the moon. And he surprised everybody at that time, even his closest entourage, at a conference one day when he actually announced that. And much to the chagrin and a surprise for his own colleagues who were closely tied to him. And he informed the world before he informed them. That tells me that he reluctantly did it because he knew this was over. Mm. So there's a lot there. There's a lot.
Yeah. I was actually doing some sort of calculations the other night when I was sort of taking into the account of the announcement by Kennedy that we're going to go to the moon in 62, and they went in 69. So it's like 8 years, but they even had to sort of put things on hold because they had the Apollo 1 fire in 67, I think it was. So they had to redesign the capsule for that, which, halted production for maybe a year and a half or something. So if that Apollo 1 fire didn't happen, they didn't have to redesign the capsule, in theory, you could have said that they could have got to the moon perhaps in 6.5 to 7 years, which is just an amazing amount of time, really, for someone that launched a man vertically up into space, 60 miles up, to then 3 weeks later announcing they were going to the moon. It is akin to a kid making a paper aeroplane to say that now in 5 or 6 years' time he's going to go flying from London to New York in a jumbo jet that he's going to make himself.
Yeah, and we're going to skip all the technology in between to get there. And that's basically that's a very good analogy, and that's exactly what happened. Of course, it turns out it didn't happen, but that's the impression that they gave that did happen, right? And I when I was looking at researching the technology in both my books, a more reasonable assessment of how long it would have taken, and that's spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year, possible for manned missions. I'm talking in terms of manned missions to the moon and back. I would say a reasonable assessment back in 1961-62 would have been at least 6 to 7, maybe 8 decades to get one with present technology. I'm not talking about technology that we don't know about, because let's face it, there seems to be technology out there. We've seen some circumstantial evidence of that we can't explain, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm just talking about in terms of our own technology. But as you said, they did it 6, 7, or 8 times within that time frame. And of course, when you mentioned the 1967 tragedy of Apollo 1, well, that brought that time frame really down to 3 hours, because they basically had to redesign that. 3 years rather. So they basically had to redesign 2 years because they landed in 1969. So they had to basically go back to the drawing board, keep the basic design, but redesign the whole thing, the systems, the wiring and everything, and have this ready without virtually any testing. I counted 4 Apollo command module test re-entries into the Earth's atmosphere. 4. 2 of them, two of those 4 were on the Saturn V, and all 3 of them basically were almost a disaster. We know Apollo 6 was the disaster. That was the second unmanned launch of the Saturn V. We know that was a disaster. So the previous 3, it was really iffy whether, you could tell they were fudging the numbers because there were some anomalies, and even admitted that. So you had, on that basis alone, they put a crew on board for the first launch, a manned crew, which was Apollo 7, and they launched that and supposedly worked perfectly. I actually get into that in my 3rd book because the 3rd book I wrote is on fiction, and we had fun speculating what was really going on and what that whole mission was about. If I was to pick one Apollo mission that was real, I would reluctantly, and I say that, emphasis added, with Apollo 7, because that was a low Earth mission, right? So I would reluctantly go with that. And it wasn't launched on the Saturn 5. It was launched on the Saturn 1B, a much smaller, with more with established technology, in terms of that. So it wasn't using the F1 engines. So I had fun in my latest book speculating on what that mission was really all about and what happened on reentry, and why subsequent missions were canceled after that because of Apollo 7. So some intriguing stuff there.
Excellent. Right. I think we better take a break here on the Paranormal Peep Show. We're talking to Randy Walsh about all things Apollo and JPL, and also the occult and how that ties up into it. So join us in part 2, where we'll continue, but we'll also be looking into the Kennedy assassination. So stay tuned.
Today's the best day of my life! Woohoo! Listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Join Andy and Neil every month on the Paranormal Peep Show, part of the Paranormal UK Radio Network, for fun, frolics and lots of information about weird stuff, UFOs, ghosts and things that go bump in the night and everything associated with them. Fascinating guests, fascinating talk, fascinating information.
Hello and welcome back. I'm Ben Emlyn-Jones. This is the Paranormal Peep Show, and I am here with Neil Ward and our guest Randy Walsh. And so we're going to continue the conversation we were having in part 1 to do with the moon landings and lots of other subjects that are related. So, well, Randy, we were just talking about strange things going on the moon of all kinds. And, of course, ever since Apollo, there was quite a long sort of trudge through the desert when it came to lunar exploration, but there have been a number of unmanned missions by all the nations, including some ones that weren't active originally, such as India, China, Japan, Israel, etc. So what do you have to say about those? Because there are some anomalies with those as well, aren't there?
Yeah, how surprising. One would think that after 5-6 decades of unmanned probes that we would have gotten this right by now, and it just seems that it's like going back in time. It's like we just set up the first probe and here we have problems all over again, with technology that is supposed to have been proven, right? Not just with American technology. We were talking other countries, the European Space Agency, Japanese Space Agency, the Chinese, the Indian Space Agency. And it was a very interesting story about the Indian unmanned probe. In the interview I was in last week, as I mentioned earlier, I had a caller ask me. Actually, he sort of was a little critical of India, and he said, they don't even have indoor plumbing, and yet they landed an unmanned probe on the moon. And I said, well, I've been to India. And India they have the extreme poverty. There's no doubt about that. But they have the opposite, the extreme technological ability by our standards. I mean, there's unfortunately, there's no in between. Very wealthy and affluent community on one side. You've got the extreme on the other side. But they do have some capabilities. But now they landed, I believe. They sent 2 unmanned probes to the moon recently. One crashed or landed upside down, something like that. I mean, it was really strange. And it turns out, and I can't prove this, but from what I've been just the cursory research I've done on this, I haven't really delved into it deeply. So I'm sure if I'm wrong, the comments will tell me I'm wrong. Our viewers are pretty good at that. I'm sure that, it seems NASA had either accidentally or purposely given them the wrong calculations.
Oh.
And that caused the mishap with their manned probe. And I'm wondering, why is NASA giving them information when they have, their own capabilities? And then it made me wonder, is NASA actually supplying coordinates to all the other space agencies in the world? In other words, are we seeing some evidence come to the surface that these unmanned probes have to seek NASA's permission before they go near the moon, let alone go near any of the Apollo landing sites? And that's what I read from this. And so they basically might have, India, I'm speculating here, but India might have said, well, we're going to go ahead and launch it anyway. So NASA says, well, let us help you. And of course, the end result wasn't very good for India. Now, I believe they launched another one, and that time was satisfactory. They had a successful landing, if I'm not mistaken, or it could have been another country. But they were steered to the south, landing on the south pole of the lunar surface. So again, we have this same scenario repeating itself over and over, that no one's allowed to land on near any of these supposed 6 Apollo landing sites. And we see this scenario play out every time this happens.
In fact, it was actually announced at one point that there was a plan to make those sites into national monuments, even though they're not actually in the United States. They're actually on the moon. And according to I forgot the name of the treaty, but according to various treaties, no one can own land on an extraterrestrial body. So, and no one can claim sovereignty over an extraterrestrial body under the current political order. Yeah, the thing about it is we do live in the age of proliferation of space technology now, which mirrors the proliferation of the nuclear weapons in generations before. We have like France, China, UK, India. Dozens of countries now have an active space program. And there's even something called the Lunar X Prize. This was issued by Google, and it was going to award a prize to any privately funded project that will launch a rocket to the moon, deploy a mobile lander on the lunar surface, and travel 0.5 kilometer and radio a signal back, which is an extraordinary feat. This was only achieved in the 60s with the Lunicod missions, and an American company called Astrobiotic Technology announced at one point it was going to send a rocket to the landing site of the Apollo 11 lunar module and send its mobile lander into the vicinity of Tranquility Base to take photographs and video footage of the LEM descent stage, the flag, and any other things that might be there. NASA's reaction was to approach the Google X Prize organizers and ask them to observe a set of exclusion zones around the landing site of the Apollo missions. They asked them to be 225 meters across, and this will include no-fly zones above the site, so as any descending rockets, so that even a rain of rocket vapor exhaust doesn't pollute the stasis that is supposedly there. But according to a 1967 treaty, this is the Treaty on the Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, no nation can claim sovereignty over any part of the non-terrestrial body or any part of space, and no one can own land on an extraterrestrial body. You can't sell parts of the moon or sell parts of planets and things like that the way you can on Earth. And so this I thought was rather a strange thing, especially considering that other state actors have also made the same statement that they plan to do the same thing. And again, NASA have stepped in and they've either asked nicely or they've tried to be a bit sneaky about trying to stop that. I mean, you think it'd be very interesting to observe these sites from close quarters. I mean, they have allegedly been they've been spotted by the Lunar Reconnaissance Observer. They've taken photographs of what supposedly are these sites. Although Jarrell White, our colleague on the fellow Apollo detective, he disputes this and has put forward a very, very good argument why that shouldn't be. But then we have what's happened since then is the various missions that have happened since Apollo have been not as successful as the Apollo program. In fact, it's a good job they're unmanned, otherwise we'd be dealing with a number of astronaut deaths in the last few years. For example, the Bereshit 1 mission, this was a public-private partnership from Israel, was about to land the Bereshit 1 craft on the lunar surface, and it failed literally within a few feet of landing. almost exactly the same thing happened to Chandrayaan-1, the first Indian landing mission to the moon. This failed, and then since then I know they've sent other craft and they've been more successful, but the first one didn't work. And then since then we've also had, I should point out that I think it was the recent, it's not the one that went upside down, I think it was a Japanese mission. I don't have the details on here. That actually did land successfully, but something very strange happened. Even though it is technically possible to broadcast a live stream of these space explorations, and indeed get video footage, as indeed we saw from Mars, where we had astonishing cine recordings of the landing of the Perseverance rover, very high quality. This is the first cine recordings ever taken on another planet. It's perfectly technically possible to do that from the moon. In fact, allegedly, it happened in the 1960s. And indeed, there's film footage of the landing of the Jade Rabbit rover on the far side of the moon from China. Yet, when this mission was in its final stages, there was literally no footage was broadcast at all to the public. The public were given views on the camera of the inside of the mission control room, and you saw an animated graphic of a spacecraft coming to rest on the lunar surface. And then we waited and waited to see photographs from the moon taken by this lander. And everyone was speculating that something had gone wrong. It's obviously buggered up again and crashed. And they just haven't told us. And then literally 45 minutes or an hour later, suddenly they published photographs. Not cine footage, photographs of the lunar surface. And it looks as you'd expect it to look. However, there are no recordings. There's no stills and there's no cine recordings of any period of the landing. And to me, this sounds like they're trying to hide something. Everyone thought they were trying to hide the fact that it crashed, when they said, no, it hasn't crashed. Look, here are the pictures. So what exactly were they trying to hide?
I would adjust your wording of cine there, Ben. Cine, to me, suggests cine films of the 70s.
I mean, motion pictures.
Yeah, video tape recordings or something like that. But yeah, I know what you're getting at.
Motion pictures, yeah.
Go on, Randy. Yeah.
Just looking at statistics, and these are NASA's own statistics. Just go back and look over the last 5 decades. You have a 40 to 50% failure rate when it comes to unmanned missions. And this again is we're talking a lot simpler technology as opposed to manned missions, because you don't have to build a bigger ship, you don't have to have atmospheric conditions, you don't have to bring food. There's many other factors involved. So you're dealing with more simple technology, if I can put it that way. And yet we still have a 40 to 50% success rate. But lo and behold, when it comes to manned missions, we're talking, 95%?
Yeah.
And more complex in terms of its missions. And another thing that I found very interesting when you were talking about this so-called treaty that the United States has or wants with other nations in terms of where they can land on the lunar surface and where they can't. What was going through my mind when you were talking about that, Ben, was Antarctica. That's the only other place on Earth where you have all the nations reluctantly or willingly agreed to a treaty to block entrance to the average person. You can go to the North Pole and freeze your butt off all you like, but you can't go to the South Pole and do that. You need permission to fly down there. And that gets into a whole other thing, when you look at Admiral Byrd in the 1950s, when he took an expedition down there and there was a firefight, what was going on there. And they've been very, very strict. And it tells me, and I think it really goes back to your cryptic point, Ben, what are they hiding? What are they hiding? And you could say that about Antarctica too, as well as the lunar surface. And also what was interesting in what you read there, by their own admission, it's illegal. It's illegal what NASA and the American government is doing in terms of preventing other nations or telling other nations where to land when it comes to the lunar surface, right? So definitely, I would have to conclude that is just more anecdotal or circumstantial evidence that they're hiding something on the lunar surface. There's definitely something they don't want people to see. Now, whether that is that There is no remnants of the Apollo missions on the lunar surface in the 6 locations that they said NASA landed there. It's interesting, too, you mentioned Gerard White. Yes, Gerard White's done some really good work on the LRO photos. I actually talked about that briefly in my book, my second book. I actually took photos from 1965 when they were launching unmanned probes back then, and they were surveilling the moon, and they were going to use that to build replicas of that on Earth to train the astronauts. Wink, wink. That's where they actually landed, on Earth, right? And the clarity of those photos, too. I'm talking about the untrained eye. I'm not a photographic expert, and you don't have to be. All you have to do is you have eyes, you see, and you look at the photos of 1965, compare them to the photos that were taken from the LRO in 2009, right? That's a 40-year difference. Take a look over 40 years. Take a look at the comparisons, and you see clarity in 1965. It's almost as good as the 3D photos that they produce today. That's how clear these photos in 1965 were taken from unmanned probes. And we're talking analog photography back then. We're no digital, right? But now we're talking digital capabilities when it comes to photography. So you take the LRO in 2009, and they produce very pristine photos of areas of the moon, except when it comes to the Apollo landing site. You get these fuzzy, distorted, lack of detail. I mean, that tells you right there.
It should incriminate to give some more comparisons in terms of space safety. I mean, manned spaceflight is not inherently safe. The space shuttle program lost 2 shuttles over the course of when it ran. In both occasions, it involved the loss of all the crew, which is what you would expect. As you say, the unmanned missions have if you are sending any kind of unmanned rocket to the moon, you have it's basically an even bet whether it'll ever succeed. And of course, the space shuttle was designed. It actually flew for the first time a decade after Apollo, and it was far more sophisticated machine. And it was intended for comparatively a very, very simple mission. We're talking about low Earth orbit and then coming down again. The Apollo mission, there were 2 major malfunctions in the Apollo program, and there were only 3 fatalities. That was the 3 astronauts of Apollo 1, and that was during a test on the launch pad, so technically that wasn't a space mission. Apollo 13 was, Marcus and I did an entire breakdown of Apollo 13 on our show, and we could discuss it on the detector. It's extraordinary. And even that course had a happy ending in the end. I mean, everyone wondered, it was a lot of doubt and a lot of fear, but it's extraordinary that a disaster, an accident of that nature, the extent of damage that was done to the spacecraft ended up with all 3 astronauts returning safely to Earth. That's really has never happened before, where that much damage is done to a spacecraft. Normally, when that much damage is done to the vehicle, basically it's goodbye to all the crew. But in this case, they survived. All 3 survived. This really should make people think. It really, really ought to, along with the photographic evidence that you mentioned as well. I mean, really, this is so incriminating, this circumstantial evidence. It really is.
Well, where's the common sense and logic in all of this? And that's what I put forward when I'm discussing this now. And our science is not based on facts. It's not based even on reality. It's based on a consensus reality. And that's where science is going. And that's changing now. That's changing. As I said earlier, last 4 years has really opened people's eyes to that. And when it comes to Apollo 13, without getting too technical, and again, I'm not an engineer and I don't pretend to be, but an explosion of that nature, just going by NASA's official, and I have read this too, NASA's official narrative, an explosion of that nature would have taken that whole ship out. There's no way that those, not even if it didn't take out the command module, it certainly would have caused enough damage where there could have been a rapid decompression of the atmosphere within inside. It would have punctured a hole. But amazingly, that didn't happen. And, again, it just tells me that it's another example of how the whole thing was scripted, especially the slingshot around the moon, the gravity assist, the fact that the lunar module, by their own admission, the lunar module was not designed to get them back to Earth, by their own admission. But lo and behold, they managed to just make it work with with some calculations sent up by mission control, because they had no computer. Their computer, according to the official version, in the Apollo 13 command module was shut down because they had to shut off all the power systems, right? And here's one other fact that I just want to point out before we move on when it comes to Apollo 13. You're familiar with the passive thermal control? With
is this the rotation
yes
thing?
Oh, yes, that's right. With the
Barbecue mode.
Yeah.
Exactly. So barbecue mode. Yeah, that's that.
Actually, that's right. Overheating. Yeah.
Exactly. So from my understanding is that the command module makes a full rotation once every 20 minutes. Okay, so that's 3 rotations an hour. And the whole idea, of course, is to dissipate the heat, to distribute the heat, which makes really no sense. They would have been better off just leaving, I think, without having the heat on one side, because if you're talking about, space being a vacuum, right? And we get into all that aspect. But here's what really amazes me with this. So on the way to the moon and on the way back, they put the command module into the barbecue roll, all right? From their own narrative to reduce the amount of heat that they're getting from the sun, because they're in direct sunlight, all right, or direct sun rays, okay? So, but the official narrative in Apollo 13 is backwards. So now they're saying that the astronauts were starting to freeze, right? So while they were freezing, they also have it in barbecue mode to keep the heat down. Well, there's a contradiction here. Are you keeping the heat down? Why are you keeping the heat down if the astronauts in the lunar module, because they've all moved into the lunar module, right?
Yeah.
Are now freezing. But they kept the corridor, the tunnel between connecting the lunar module and the command module together so they can go back and forth. Now, the narrative actually says that the astronauts, one of them at a time, took turns sleeping in the command module, and the other 2 were manning the ship, shall I say, in the lunar module. But then it turned out that everybody had to take turns sleeping within the lunar module because it was too cold in the command module. But that doesn't make any sense. Why would it be too cold? Why didn't you stop the barbecue roll? Maybe that might have helped. Why is it that we're talking about a ship that's only about 2-3 feet away from them with an open tunnel? That's cold, right? And now the lunar module is cold. Well, they argued that because we turned off the electronics, it's not producing heat. But that doesn't make any sense, because then they continued with the barbecue roll. If they were that cold, why did they continue with the barbecue roll? So you see, their own narrative doesn't add up. And that, to me, is what I mentioned earlier. Where's the logic and common sense in this? Because my question to NASA would be, well, how could they be cold when you actually have to take precautions from the sun? How is it that shutting down the electronics in the command module, while you seemingly have the electronics working in the lunar module, because you now rely on the lunar module computer, right, which is less powerful, how is it now that it's too cold? So all these kinds, I don't have an answer, but there's all these kinds of questions that come up. So that's when I said earlier, the devil is in the details. And when you read those details, you just say to yourself, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. Where's the logic and common sense here?
I find it also an irony is that in 1971, when Apollo 13 occurred, it was also during the Vietnam War. And yet they got the whole world to pray for these 3 astronauts that God returns them safely to Earth. Yet no one was praying for any of the Vietnam soldiers or the North Vietnamese people dying in a conflict that was happening right next door to them virtually. They're praying for 3 complete strangers in outer space.
It was a publicity
point, well taken.
Total publicity. It was made to play into people's imaginations and win their hearts and minds, which is a phrase used in Vietnam War strategy, to win the hearts and minds of the American people for a particular purpose. Yeah.
It is a point well taken, and and then you had the famous sportscaster Howard Cosell and interrupting a football game, announcing the tragedy or the seriousness situation that was going on with Apollo 13. But you're right. I don't think he's ever paid homage to the young men and women that were losing their lives on both sides in the Vietnam War.
Yeah,
and that's very interesting, and that's a very good point, Neil. There was one other point I wanted to mention about, when it comes to Apollo 13, I know you've talked a lot about this, so we won't get in. I'm sure we don't need to go into it here, but there is a lot of, I would say, more than circumstantial evidence. There's actually photographic evidence that the Soviet Union and the Americans were working a lot closely when it came to Apollo 13. I think that's an established fact now.
Well, of course, they were planning for the Apollo-Soyuz link-up later on in 73 or 4, I can't remember.
Yeah.
Which I believe the handshake, if I'm correct in memory, the handshake that occurred between the Russian cosmonaut and the American, I don't know who was it, Albin or something, or he was Skylab or something. And
I think
Apollo. But between the US astronaut and the cosmonaut, the handshake between the Apollo-Soyuz link-up occurred over Bournemouth, which is the seaside town less than an hour away from where I am. So,
oh, seriously?
Was there looking up in the sky?
Yeah. I remember as a kid looking up at the sky, and you could see Skylab quite clearly, So when you could say space is totally fake, there's nothing up there, I'm absolutely convinced there are objects up there. You see these things orbiting from time to time. Skylab was a very, very bright orbiting object at the time, and of course when they filmed Skylab returning to Earth anyway, as broken up fragments of broken satellite and stuff.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Skylab, because Skylab, and I believe that they do have low Earth capability. There are some things that are real. A lot of things are fake, but there are some things that are real. And I agree with you that they do have that capability, but it's of no practical use. There's just no use for it unless you're using it as a stepping stone to get to other planets. But of course, that involves exotic technology that we don't have. But Skylab, before I leaves my mind here, Skylab, of course, was the last launch of a Saturn V, and that was in 1975, or was it 1973 or 1975? One of those years. And of course, Skylab was damaged when they had discovered that Skylab was damaged on when it reached low Earth orbit. And of course, that caused its decay over the next several years and then re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, I believe, in 1979. Now, what's interesting about that is just they've come up with all kinds of reasons why Skylab was damaged, right? And they did, of course, send several crews up there. But I speculate, and this is just one more speculation, I believe that the Saturn V launches, the Apollo program was to hide the true reason for the Saturn V launches. I think they were actually trying to get something out of those engines. They may have succeeded temporarily. And I think when it came to the last launch of Skylab with the Saturn V, I believe that there was a failure of one of the engines or two of the engines in the F1 first stage of the Saturn V, which probably caused the damage to Skylab. Because remember, when you look back at the launch of Apollo 6, which was the second launch of an unmanned Saturn V, that was almost a catastrophic failure. And there is an engineer who was closely tied to the Apollo program. He's on YouTube. We've all seen him speak. And he said that if there had been a crew on board, because of the pogo effect and the vibration, if there had been a crew on board, they would have had to abort. That's how serious that second launch was. And of course, they went from that launch, unmanned, 7 months later, to a manned launch on Saturn V, but no testing in between, either static and or flight testing, and it was supposedly perfect. And so I think they were definitely, that was one aspect of the Saturn V program. And after the launch of Skylab, that's when they discontinued it. They just weren't able to succeed in getting any reliable output from the F1 engines.
So I think Skylab was a very expensive tin can in space just to blow water bubbles, really. That's all it seemed to be.
And had no practical purpose whatsoever. And really, no station really does, unless when we go back to the 1950s and take Wernher von Braun's concept, or maybe Jack Parsons, maybe he was the one that came up with that idea. Maybe that's why he was possibly silenced, right? Maybe it was him. But because they had to justify bringing Nazi scientists over to America after World War II. So they needed some justification for that. And of course, the Soviet Union had their bunch as well. But I'm wondering if a lot of those ideas were really Jack Parsons' idea and they had needed to get him out of the way, or maybe they did get him out of the way. Maybe it was a fake death. I don't know, right? But Wernher von Braun, just giving him the benefit of the doubt that he came up with this, the only sole purpose I could see for a space station is to use as a platform to launch. It's impractical to be launching from Earth. You cannot launch anything heavier than a Saturn V. If you had an explosion at the Saturn V rocket on the launch pad, it would be equivalent to a 1 kiloton bomb, a small atomic bomb. The devastation would be enormous. You couldn't be anywhere near 5 or 10 miles of that explosion, right? And try building something bigger, and then do the math. Multiply the thrust output from the Saturn V engines, which is 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Multiply that by 3 times. And think of what will happen if there was a catastrophic explosion within that vicinity. You'd have to be a minimum 10 to 15 miles away from there. It's just not practical. It's not practical. So if we were really serious about manned missions, they would have been working on Wernher von Braun's concept, in the 1950s of building a space platform. And that would take decades to do. That in and of itself would have required decades, tons of research, lots of, incredible minds to make this work. It would have been at least 3 to 4 decades. That's what I meant earlier when I said if they were going to launch anything to the moon, manned-wise to the moon or Mars even, which Mars is impossible. You cannot launch a manned mission to Mars with this technology. You cannot survive. You won't survive that 10-month trip. It's just not survivable, all right? And you don't even have to know the science background to know it's not survivable. You just have to use logic and common sense. But I do believe that it would have taken several decades to get that platform and that apparatus in low Earth orbit, then to use as a launch base, a launch vehicle to send other manned missions from there out. And also, it would be like a repair station and a rescue station. There was absolutely no means of rescuing a manned crew that might have been in distress between here and the moon. So they had no means of doing that. So basically, it was a one-way mission. It was either do or die. You were, if anything happened, you were not coming back. So just on that basis alone, when you think about that basis, the psychology, as Bart Sabrile said, and I agree with him, if people could just let go of their emotional ties to the Apollo program, they'll see it for what it really is. And he's right.
Yeah.
So, could I add one thing about that, because that's very interesting?
Sure.
Just a couple of things. Firstly, as far as the issue with Soviet cooperation, there's a book called National Suicide by Anthony Sutton. This isn't about the space missions, but it is about Soviet-American relations before and during the Cold War, and which are totally and utterly different to what the public were told about Soviet-American relations. And it mirrors the Nazi-Soviet and Nazi-American relations and Nazi-British relations in World War II as well, and before that. Secondly, Arthur C. Clarke wrote a story. It was actually a serialized story. It was called The Other Side of the Sky. And it was a fiction. It was written in 1952, and it was all about the first ever, a fictional account of the first manned mission to the moon. Now, I should point out, Arthur C. Clarke's stories, he regularly consulted with scientists and people in the early space program. He regularly consulted with these people. And this story is based on his discussions with scientists. In this particular story, there's these rockets to the moon. They launch from, as Randy has just described, an orbiting space platform. They're constructed in space, and they're launched from an orbiting space platform to the moon. And then they go into orbit, and then there's like a descent stage. It's a very interesting story, written long before any real space missions. It's very interesting.
Well, 2001 displayed that kind of idea very well, really, with its orbiting space station. You had the Orion shuttle go up to the space station, and then they took a further ship out, a different, I think it was I forget what they called it, but it was a moon shuttle or something it was called. It wasn't anything like the Orion shuttle that launched from Earth to the space station. And then this shuttle landed down on the moon and landed on the base that they had on the moon. Which was, that film was very advanced for its time in the concept of everything. And really, that's how presumably you should be doing stuff now. And it's only...
Keep talking.
Yeah, sure. It's only in this day and age now they're talking about those kind of concepts in practical ways, like they're talking about a lunar gateway and what else? A lunar gateway. They're talking about maybe a space station orbiting maybe the Earth at some point, but certainly they're talking about a lunar gateway, which is a space station basically orbiting the moon. And the idea is that a craft will fly out to the moon, dock with this orbiting gateway, as they call it, and then take a secondary craft down to the moon from there. They are decades away from constructing anything of that at the minute. I mean, it's all kind of just on the drawing board at the minute, and budgets and plans will likely change anyway. But that is very hard to see Clark at that particular point anyway, except they've moved the orbiting space station from Earth, they've moved it right into the orbit of the moon. Don't know why, but they seem to think that the moon is a good place to jump off to go to Mars. But essentially, you still got to launch people from Earth to get up into space to then land on the moon, to then take off from the moon to go to Mars. You think, well, why don't just do it in one trip? I don't know.
Yeah, I was correct. Actually, the story is called Venture to the Moon. It's a series of 6 connected stories that were published in the Evening Standard, and they're now in some of the books of Arthur C. Clarke. But it's a really fascinating thing to read. Again, the scientists in the 1950s were not talking about the kind of space mission that eventually emerged a decade later from NASA. So why did they change the entire mission profile?
Well, it's interesting to note too that I believe Arthur C. Clarke had intelligence connections too. So I'm wondering if a lot of what he was writing was a psyops, and I mean his ideas are far, I think, more tangible than the idea they ultimately came up with. You know, with the launching from Earth and then the lunar orbit rendezvous. That method was, you know, it's just not feasible. But that was probably the only way they could sell. I mean, let's face it. If they were to go with either Wernher von Braun, because remember, Wernher von Braun wanted to do what was called a direct entry and back. It's like he had a massive rocket the size of he wanted to launch something the size of the Empire State Building. From Earth. He said, if you're going to launch from Earth, that's the only way you're going to be able to do this. All right. So if you're not going to launch a rocket the size of the Empire State Building, then you're looking at launching 3, maybe 4 rockets, not as large as the Empire State Building, but certainly larger than these, or to launch the equipment to get them there, the propellant that they would really need. So, you know, you really put that really puts it all into perspective. It really does. I mean, the whole thing was a psyops, and it ties in with so many other aspects, which, again, I get into. Because, you know, in my new book, it's fiction, and I was able to speculate. So it's everything I've learned in the last 5-6 years, all my research, inside and outside of my 2 books, all culminated in that one. And it gave us a chance to sort of go down some rabbit holes and speculate a little bit. And actually, we based it on truth. So that's just something to keep in mind about the Arthur C. Clarke, that he had intelligence connections. So just for people to keep that in mind.
I think we'll move on now from the Apollo thing. I just want to say this very briefly, though, and it's concerning the radiation, the Van Allen radiation belts, you know, because, you talk about the original concept was the size of the Saturn V being the size of the Empire State Building. And I remember Wernher von Braun talking in the 1950s film saying the size of a ship would have to be the size of the Queen Mary, which is probably the same size as the Empire State Building or something like that. But also when they launched Explorer 1 or whatever the ships were that went up to detect the Van Allen radiation belts, they suspected something was up there. And Van Allen himself, James Van Allen, confirmed it. And basically he wrote an article that says that these 2 belts of radiation will be prohibitive to safe manned spaceflight, basically. And then, hey presto, a few years later, they're launching people through them. And it's only when pressed that NASA says, oh, yeah, well, they received nothing more than a chest X-ray. It makes you wonder, thinking, well, why didn't Van Allen say that in his article, saying, yeah, it's perfectly safe to fly through the Van Allen radiation belt. So as long as you fly through very fast, you're likely to get nothing more than a chest X-ray. It doesn't bear thinking about, really. He was writing kind of some extremely dangerous stuff it's to travel through, and yet here we are being told that they're getting nothing more than a chest X-ray. And yeah, then later on they're talking about the dangers of radiation. Thinking, well, hang on, it was a chest X-ray 50 years ago. What's changed?
Yeah, and it's very interesting because back in 1958, when James Van Allen himself said that, and he was asked, is a manned missions to the, traveling through the Van Allen belts possible? He said, no, unless you go through the North and South Pole. But when you think about that for a second, that's an enormous distance for any spacecraft. The Apollo missions, with their limited propellant capacity, would have to travel. And you're talking tens of thousands of miles more off their track to get, to go north, because they lost in the equator. So they'd have to go north through the North Pole or through the South Pole. And you're talking a huge amount of distance. So you would have to carry more fuel. Now, as for the Van Allen belts, so you have the two of them, right? But there's not just two. It depends on what time of year we're talking about, because solar flares can create a third artificial radiation belt. And then you have the nuclear explosions that were launched, the 3 nuclear missiles that were launched into low Earth orbit in the 1958, 1959, which contaminated and caused a third belt. And then you have the thermonuclear explosion that was launched in 1962. That's a thermonuclear weapon, at least 1,000 to 2,000 times more powerful than either of the previous weapons they launched. And that contaminated, there was I'm being very basic here, but you're talking about a half-life of some serious intense radiation of 25 plus years. And that's still a factor up there. So then when you factor in the August 4, 1972 event, just before the last so-called Apollo mission, Apollo 17, you had a radiation belt that formed from the massive solar flare that they had back then. NASA itself admits that if the astronauts hadn't been caught on that, they would have been killed instantly. And yet, of course, 5 months later, they went ahead and launched the crew anyway. That there's that logic and common sense again, right? So, so you're looking at not just two. So you've got the inner belt, the inner dominated proton belt, and then you've got that's the natural form belt, and then you've got the outer, supposedly less intense electron belt. All right. And of course, NASA said that it went through the outer regions of the outer belt. But then when you look at its trajectory, they contradict themselves, because it's not always right. It's not always what they say it is. And then add in the other 2 or 3 artificial radiation belts, and you're a lot longer in there. Now, when you're talking radiation, as you just mentioned earlier, when you're talking radiation, wouldn't you want to be as specific as possible when it comes to time that you're going to be in that radiation region, because of the exposure to the astronauts? Because remember, the astronauts had no radiation protection. The material that the command module was made out of, it attenuates. That theory is this is supposed to attenuate the radiation down to an acceptable level, given the time that they were supposed to be in the Van Allen belts. But there's no protection. And so if that's the case, and then when you want to do precise calculations to find out, well, exactly how long are they going to be in there? Are they going to be in there for 15 minutes? Is it 20 minutes? And is the attenuation going to be enough? And you, on top of that, you would need that data in real time, which they had no capability of doing back then, because the Van Allen belts are constantly in flux. Having said that, and I'll bottom line it here, having said that, I've read many reports from NASA itself over the years, and from people in support of NASA and in support of the Apollo missions, that promote the Apollo missions, that give conflicting data when it comes to the irradiation. I think his name is Richard Braddock, famously posted talking about, it was safe for the Apollo astronauts to go through because they went through this area and they only spent 10, 15 minutes. He's since has taken his paper down, right? But those calculations are based on an estimate. He uses mathematics, a lot of mathematics, but ultimately he's just coming up with an estimate. He's not using real-time data for any specific Apollo mission. And that needs to be emphasized. There was no specific data. They had overall data, or so they claim, but they had no specific data for each mission. And that's what they based this on.
Okay. Right. So thank you for that. We've been talking about the Apollo missions. Now we'll take it right back and we'll talk about the guy that set the ball rolling for the Apollo missions, going from Jack Parsons, we're going to Jack Kennedy now. And so you've been writing a book, or you're partway through writing a book about the assassination of Kennedy. And I believe there's some sort of strange connections in that with occult stuff or something, but maybe you could highlight that for us if you can, Randy.
Sure. Well, first of all, I went down to Dealey Plaza where Kennedy was assassinated back in 2005. My wife and I, we decided to, I've always wanted to check out the site for myself, and I wanted to visit the Texas School Book Depository, which they've now turned into, on the 6th floor, they've turned into a museum in dedication or in honor of JFK. And when we went down there, my wife is really good at this. She noticed some numbers, and the numbers all had very occult symbology. And the other aspect to it is that you would see statues of gargoyles, which were on the rooftops of the buildings surrounding them. And the whole thing reeks of, has a lot of occult aspects to it, and a lot of Freemasonry symbology involved as well. And the other interesting point, and that's, by the way, not the premise of my book. I'm just sort of putting this out as sort of an afterthought, if I can put it that way. The other thing to keep in mind is that, when it comes to numbers, I'm going to be looking a lot more into this. I am going to write a chapter on it because I think it's fascinating. I think people need to know. I mentioned the force higher than the military earlier. I'm not sure it was this interview or another interview. And that force may tie in with the occult aspect of all of this. And these people, if you notice, these people in positions of power, whether you like it or not, whether people want to hear this or not, because I know some people get annoyed about this, but they're all connected in some way. It's either Skull and Bones, Freemasonry, Illuminati, you name it, they're involved in it. And in fact, it seems to be you have to be a member of the club in order to get not only to where you are in politics, but to get to where you are in the music industry. If you're not a member of the club, you don't reach that level of fame and fortune. And even when you reach that level of fame and fortune, this is just a sidebar issue, when you reach that level of fame and fortune, you don't have control over your own wealth. You're very controlled. You're controlled. Your money's controlled. The material that you put out is controlled. I mean, that's the world we're talking about. It's very dark. So when it came to Dealey Plaza and the assassination, it's interesting that Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd. And then when you add the month, number 11, that becomes 33. 33 is a very, very important number when it comes to Freemasonry. Lyndon Johnson, who succeeded him, was a 33rd degree Freemason. Mm-hmm. And Dealey Plaza itself is very close to 33rd degree latitude in geographical location. So you factor all this in, and then you look at the coincidence between the Kennedy assassination and the Lincoln assassination, and you have to ask yourself, is that by design, or is that cosmic, as people would say? I'm beginning to wonder if it's by design, and if it's by design, the similarities between those two assassinations, you're familiar with that. Both presidents were shot on a Friday, both in the presence of their wife. Lincoln was shot in the Ford Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Ford Lincoln. And his secretary, Kennedy's secretary was Lincoln. You find all these, and then you find the assassin of Lincoln had this had a 3 name, James I think it was Booth, yeah. But it was 3 names, and Lee Harvey Oswald, and all the names add up to 15 letters each. It's just uncanny. They were shot. It's just amazing. Even Johnson, there's similarities between Lyndon Johnson and Lincoln's vice president. It's just uncanny. And you have to wonder if this is by design. this shows you the depth of the conspiracy involved to take Kennedy out. Was taking Kennedy out, and this is the other question, was it because of his policies? Or was it in part because of his policies, but could it be also in part as a psyops? Could that whole concept be the idea of assassinating him the way they did? Because there was other ways of doing it. Kennedy had very serious health problems. That's no secret. That came out even before his election. And he managed to sort of pave that over. Could it have been a psyops, like a psychological operation in the sense that it was designed to traumatize the American public? Could it be the beginning of where we are right now? Could that have started then? Could this be the beginning of an infiltration of American society, government, its institutions, and American society through the Kennedy assassination? And when you add in the occult aspect, you see the many layers involved. And in my book, I actually I analyze the official version. So I start off in chapter 1 with the Warren Report, because I don't want it just to be about the occult. I actually get into that. And then I analyze the people who use psychology to try to discredit the conspiracy theorist, if I put it that way, and in favor of the official version. And then the third chapter, which I just finished, I talk about how some of the supporters who are being promoting the official version of the assassination are actually, in essence, hinting very subtly that there was a lot more going on here. And I talk about that. And then I'll definitely get into the evidence. And then I'm going to get into what I think is the real conspiracy behind Kennedy, because a lot of new information has come out in the last several years. And there was a very interesting interview that Lyndon Johnson, former President Lyndon Johnson at the time, remember he abruptly announced in 1968 that he would not run for a second term. And in 1969, after he left office, he gave an interview to CBS anchor Walter Cronkite. And in that interview, he was asked about the Warren Commission report. And Johnson had said at that time, he says, I believe that there were international connections.
Well, during a long interview I had with Mr. Johnson at the LBJ Ranch in September 1969, we talked about the Kennedy assassination. A portion of the interview was not broadcast at the president's request on the grounds, he said, of national security. I asked Mr. Johnson then whether he was satisfied there was no international conspiracy in his assassination.
I can't honestly say that I've ever been completely relieved of the fact that there might have been international connections.
You mean you still feel that there might have been?
Well, I have not completely discounted.
Well, that would seem to indicate that you don't have full confidence in the Warren Commission report.
No, I think the Warren Commission study, and I think, first of all, is composed of the ablest, most judicious, bipartisan men in this country. Second, I think they had only one objective, and that was the truth. Third, I think they were competent and did the best they could. But I don't think that they or me or anyone else is always absolutely sure of every thing that might have motivated Oswald or others that...
Walter Cronkite asked him, is that a repudiation of the Warren Report? And he said, no. He says, I believe that they did a thorough job and they got at some of this, they got some facts out and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting about that is that after the interview was over, he asked that interview be classified. So it was. CBS classified the interview. Lyndon Johnson died 3 years later in 1972, and then it was in 1975 when that interview was finally released. And you can find that, you can find that on YouTube. But it got me thinking. I'd known about that interview for 10 years or more, but it was only recently when I actually looked at the interview because something struck me when what Johnson said. He said, I quote, I believe there were international connections in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Now, it's reasonable to assume that he was talking either about Cuba and or the Soviet Union, because a year before Kennedy was assassinated, there was actually 3 months into Kennedy's presidency, he approved a CIA plan to infiltrate and start an uprising in Cuba, and they were to enter an area called the Bay of Pigs in the southern end of Cuba, and that went sideways. What the CIA didn't tell Kennedy when Kennedy approved it is that the only way for this to succeed is to have U.S. military involvement. But Kennedy made the stipulation that there will be no U.S. military involvement. These all have to be unmarked planes, because he didn't want the world to see the U.S. involved in the overthrow of a sovereign country, and which made a lot of sense. But what Kennedy wasn't told, that the mission was bound to fail, and they thought that they could pressure him, the CIA thought that they could pressure him into sending in U.S. forces, but Kennedy stood fast, and he said no. And to Kennedy's credit, he said no, and the mission failed. And the CIA hated him for that. I mean, they were beside themselves. Kennedy ended up firing Allen Dulles, who was then the CIA director, because of his betrayal. And he also fired a general by the name of Charles Cabal, who was also involved in the Bay of Pigs attempt to invade Cuba. Now, it's interesting that there's Charles Cabal, the general that Kennedy fired in 1961. His brother, Earl Cabal, was the mayor of Dallas, Texas, the very day that Kennedy was assassinated. And it turns out now that General Charles Cabal and his brother Earl Cabal, the mayor of Texas, right, who probably would be responsible for a lot of the security that day, both are now known as now been proven to have had CIA connections. So you see how it all ties in? Yeah. So then you move forward 2 years later to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and again you've got Kennedy fighting with his, not only with the opposition, in Congress and the Senate, that we needed to go further and take Cuba out, but you had him fighting with his Joint Chiefs of Staff. So Kennedy, again, stood down, and he went behind their backs, and he worked out a deal secret behind us. They wanted him to invade Cuba. They thought that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the perfect opportunity to do so, regardless of the fact that we were all risking World War III and thermonuclear war. I mean, back then they had the capability of doing what they have the capability of doing now, and it's a little frightening that we're now on that precipice once again. But just to sort of round this out, so Kennedy had struck a backroom deal with Nikita Khrushchev at the time, and had secretly agreed not to, if he pulled his missiles out of Cuba, he would not. He would take his missiles out of Turkey, which were aimed directly at the Soviet Union at the time. That was a secret deal. But of course, the military knew this. So the military, after this, that's another mark on Kennedy. So after this, Kennedy had was approached by his own chiefs of staff, and this actually came out from a Freedom of Information Act through the National Security Agency. And he was asked to approve a plan called Operation Northwoods. And anybody can look this up. It's actually on Google. You can look it up. And the plan was for to approve terrorist attacks around the country, and that included shooting passenger airliners down, and then to blame it on Cuba as a pretext for war.
Wow.
To take Cuba out. So when you put the occult stuff aside is enough. Just look at the political and the geopolitics at that time. I mean, you can see already that he's up against some serious forces. But I think he began to realize this. The Cuban Missile Crisis really opened his eyes. Kennedy was intelligent, and he was a very intelligent man, but he was young and naive, and he didn't fully understand the power against him when he got into office. But it was only after the Cuban Missile Crisis that really opened his eyes, and he started to make moves. And one of the moves he did, and I'm not saying this is the sole reason, he started making moves on the central banking system, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, a lot of people don't understand, a lot do, is that the federal banking system has an enormous amount of power, not just in the United States, but around the world. And that's what I think Lyndon Johnson was hinting at when he said that there were international connections. I think it goes far beyond Cuba, the Soviet Union. I think it goes even higher than that. And I think there may be an occult aspect involved in it as well. So that's basically the direction I'm going in. And I even think I could identify maybe 2 or 3 of the shooters. I've sort of established so far that there were at least 3 assassination teams in place that were, one was to take over, one missed type of thing. And also, there's one other point I want to bring up, and this has come out recently, and this is really going to be, it's annoying to some people, but we talked earlier about the movie The Shining.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about the undertones, the hidden message in the movie The Shining in terms of faking the Apollo missions. And there was, Jay Weidner was actually quite famous for, he did some really good work on that. And he made a documentary showing how Stanley Kubrick was basically putting hidden messages in that movie, indicating that he faked or was involved in some way in faking the Apollo missions, right? Well, Stanley, with Jay Weidner has now come out with a documentary just within the last couple of months. His theory being that Kennedy faked his assassination.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and it's getting a lot of attention. The reviews online are about 3.5 out of 5, so a lot of people are not buying it. But I haven't looked at the documentary yet, but I've listened to 2 or 3 interviews with Jay Weidner, an hour or so each. I mean, I was really getting into it. And I do not give Jay Weidner credit for that theory. He's been given credit for coming up with that theory. But that theory's been out, and I've been following this. This has been out for about 4, 5, 6 years now. This theory actually came out in 2018, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of videos online about it. I didn't buy it then, and I'm not buying it now. But while I will say, because I looked into it and I just don't see the evidence, because if for argument's sake, let's say this, if for argument's sake Kennedy participated in faking his assassination, okay, why do it in the public domain? Why do it for millions of people to see? Why traumatize the American people like that? Why traumatize the people of the world? Look at the psychological impact that had on people, whether it was fake or not. You saw this blood all over the place. There was a lot of, supposedly Jay Weidner said that there was a lot of gimmicks used to fake it. You know, Kennedy was trained on this and he was prepped for it. And then the other theory is that it wasn't Kennedy in the car that day. It was one of his doubles. Kennedy had doubles.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all presidents do. No secret here. If there was an assassination attempt and Kennedy wasn't killed, I can reluctantly buy the theory that it was a double that was in that car that day that was killed. But I have trouble believing that Kennedy would participate in that if he was supposed to be on the side of the good, but yet he participates in faking his own assassination and traumatizing his own people. That tells me that he would be on the side of the good. He'd be on the side of the bad. Right? So that has to be taken into consideration too. But one thing that Jay Weidner has come out with, and I agree with this, because it's always good to look at this in an objective way. As we talked about in the other video with the researcher in Ireland, it's always good to keep your mind open and have an objective look at this. Jay Weidner has, I think, successfully proven that the Zapruder film, the best film, The Assassination, is missing frames, and it's may have been altered, but not the whole film. If you look at the film and you see the motorcade coming down, you see Kennedy waving to the crowd, and there's a big sign in the way, and as soon as he goes behind the sign, that's when the first shot hits, right? But before the sign, as he's coming, there's a shot fired, and there's a slight reaction from Kennedy because he hears a noise, but he doesn't know what it is. So he continues on waving. But as the car goes behind the sign, the second shot hits him, and as he comes out, you see he's obviously reacting. But what does he do when he's hit? People say he grabs his neck. That's not what happened. It's shortly right after that, about a second after you see his reaching for his neck, that's where I believe the film is altered. And that's what I think Jay Widener's actually pointing out as well, to his credit. And that's where it's really difficult to believe anything after that point until further down when you see the motorcade driving out from that area under the bridge and racing to Parkland Hospital. Now, what happens when he's first shot? His arms flitch up like that. Okay? If you look closely, his right arm goes way up and his left arm comes up to about here. He's not grabbing his neck. That's a neural reflex. Something struck his spinal cord. And I'm not a doctor, don't pretend to be a medical doctor or scientist, but I've read enough about this, struck a spinal cord and caused his arms to flinch up. Would he have known to do that if this was a fake assassination? That sounds a little far-fetched to me. It sounds like that looks to me like an actual reaction to being shot, right? And the bullet that entered him probably entered his back and splintered. The bullet itself splintered and a segment came out his throat. That probably wasn't an entry wound. It was probably a fragment from the bullet coming out his throat. Jay Widener says, when you look at that, where's all the blood? Well, that would explain why there was little blood at that point, because if it was the speck of the bullet coming out his throat, causing little blood, and the other bullet was diverted upwards towards his brain, he was probably killed before the headshot. He was probably dead at that point. And that to me shows me that whoever was in that car that day, whether it was Kennedy or one of his doubles, a person was killed that day in that car. And the other aspect to faking his assassination that you would have to account for was Lee Harvey Oswald killed. Was Officer J.D. Tippit killed that day? Apparently, Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to have shot him. And what about all the other witnesses involved that have mysteriously died? And I'll be writing a chapter on that. Have died under very mysterious circumstances related to the assassination. So there's all this that has to be taken into consideration. So as you can see, I've pretty well gone down the rabbit hole on this.
Yeah. Ben, what's your thoughts on the Kennedy assassination?
Well, we have just passed the 60th anniversary of that event a couple of months ago, and I did a couple of special publications for that. And indeed, these anniversaries are informational choke points, which means that they're opportunities to publish new information that's more likely to be seen by the general public. So this is a good time to write a book like that and to bring a book like that out. There are so many theories about what happened to Kennedy. I mean, I covered them all in my special radio show and my special video about it. But the one thing that's certain is the official story is false. Oswald acted alone for his own personal motives. He was the only shooter, and things like that. None of it makes sense for so many different reasons. But I mean, I haven't seen Jay Widener's new film. I've not heard this particular theory that Randy said. I've heard people talk about how the Zapruder film was altered. There's several theories about that. There's things I don't buy. I think maybe just the red herrings. For example, the Umbrella Man, the guy with the umbrella, and also the Greer turned around and shot Kennedy with a pistol. That when you look closely, you can see that's not what actually happens. But there's lots and lots of different theories going out about this, and it seems even after 60 years, there's still something new to learn, and that's good. I mean, whether we'll get an answer to this, I don't know if when Anthony J. Hilder first started doing lectures about this just after it happened, whether he thought 60 years later people would still not have the truth, and we still wouldn't know. I don't know if he ever suspected that. If he had, would he have given up if he had?
I have a favourite kind of JFK assassination theory, and it's a hypothetical one that never happened, of course, because it was a Star Trek plot. When they were bringing back Star Trek to the big screen, which they did do in 1979, they went through many different ideas of what story they could use, and one of them was, I think it was might have been Alan Dean Foster, but I'm not 100% certain on that. Alan Dean Foster, science fiction writer, who wrote Alien. The idea was that the Starship Enterprise goes back in time to try and prevent the death of President Kennedy, and then when they return, they save him. And then when they return back to their own time in the 23rd century, they find that there's no Star Trek Federation, no Starfleet or anything like that. And they think, oh, we screwed up. So they have to go back in time to 1969. And in this version, Spock goes up with his phaser and assassinates President Kennedy. And I really love that one the best.
It's a shame that was never produced because it's obviously totally unrealistic because of the time travel paradoxes and things, but it's hilarious. That would have been hilarious if that had been produced.
Yeah, can you imagine that being the Zapruder Cine film? Point-head man with a phaser pistol or something. Right, I think we'll have to draw this chat to a close, gentlemen. I think we've gone past our 55-minute section for part 2. We're well into the hour and 10-minute mode for part 2, but that's fine. We've enjoyed it immensely, and we've learned quite a few good things of interest today, and I hope the audience has too. So I want to say thank you very much for Randy Walsh for joining us once again on the Paranormal Peep Show. Now, you mentioned some books there you got coming out. You got a third book on the Apollo side of things. When is that due out, Randy?
That's out now, and it's now up on Amazon.
Okay.
And,
what's the title of that?
The title is Apollo, The Real Mission.
Okay. And it's written by another person as well.
Yes. Her name is Robin Landry. She's on the back here. And and we teamed up. Maybe we could talk about that in another video more. How it's interesting how that project evolved. But it's now out. The book is fiction, but based on truth. And the basic premise is that they discover a journal. The book starts in 1960s, goes up to the time period of today. And the first astronaut, changed his name. It's based on Neil Armstrong. But I changed his name in the book to avoid any legal conflicts. And so it's a fictional character based on a true story. And basically, before he dies, he says, "We didn't do it. None of it happened. There's a journal. Find it." And that's what the book goes on. Yeah.
Excellent. You can always change the astronaut's name to Neil Ward. I won't.
Yes, I could. Sure.
I'd like to see one in history.
I'll keep that in mind.
Okay. And then your Kennedy book. You're still writing that. You're sort of like a third of the way through it or something?
Yeah, so I'm about a third of the way through it. It'll probably take me at least another several months because there's a lot of information I want to go into. I want people to know that it's not based on the occult, but there is going to be a chapter in there on it because I do find it an interesting aspect of the Kennedy. But the bulk of the book is going to be on the mechanics of the assassination, the geopolitics involved. And I will be talking about, Ben, I'm glad you brought that up. The Secret Service agents supposedly shot him. They are such bogus theories out there. And I agree with you on that one. And I'm going to be talking about some of those theories in the book. I'm going to say, which has some validity and which don't. And that one obviously doesn't. You're right about the Zapruder film. It's not, it's reflection. It's not him pointing a gun. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So that'll be due out later this year, though, the Kennedy book.
Yeah, I'll try to have it out. It'll hopefully be out by, I'm thinking of November, which should be a good day to have it. It could be November, December, or January, but it will be hopefully out by then. Like I said, I'm almost halfway through it. I'm taking my time in it because I want it done right. There's a lot of books out there in the Kennedy assassination. And people are going to ask, well, why another one? Well, I think I do have not only something different, but a different twist on it. So that's what I'm looking at right now. So I'll keep you informed.
What's the title? Sorry, I was going to say, what's that one called?
The JFK book? I have a working title right now. Actually, I have a working title. I don't want to say it right now.
Okay, fair enough.
Everybody likes the title I've talked to, so somebody might. I'm
keep it to yourself. It's out there.
I tell you what, I'll email it to you.
Yeah, sure. No, I won't. I won't publish it or anything like that. Yeah, fine.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, I was supposed to say, using fictional allegory is a very, very good way of communicating information. I've written some fictional allegorical novels myself, the Roswell trilogy, I call them, and it's in a way. I mean, I think it goes back to George Orwell and his own fiction, which was very allegorical, very metaphorical for real things, and it's in a sense it gets through a lot of the filters that would be set up by skeptics and people like that for a non-fictional book.
And it's perfectly okay to speculate based on the evidence, your opinion. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Right. Okay. Ben, how can people find you?
Well, I mean, I've got my website, Hospital Porters Against the New World Order, HPANWO. It's pronounced Hapanwo. And on the aforementioned book, well, here it is. This is the first one, Roswell Rising, a novel of disclosure. And that's the first of the trilogy. And that's £10 in all good bookshops. And I think if you like the Paranormal Peep Show, I think you'll enjoy this book. You really will. So I do urge listeners to give it a try, because it's just up your street, you might say.
Excellent. Well, I'll plug my own book now then.
Go ahead. Yeah. Please do.
So my book, I don't know when it's due out, but it's now completed, and it's with the publisher, and it's titled True Tales of the Paranormal by Neil Ward, and it will be out on Arcturus Publishing, and I'm presuming sometime in the summer. I'm told by the editor they've already got the cover sorted out. I haven't seen that at all. Although I'm an artist, I've got nothing to do with the art side of things on this particular book, but I will obviously let people know more about that as time goes on. I'll probably put it on a website or something, but yeah, that's coming out in the near future. And I know that Randy watched our last show, Ben, where we were talking in the summer house. He really enjoyed our psychic tales and all sorts of fancy stuff.
Thanks,
we
Randy.
covered.
Thanks very much, Randy. Glad you enjoyed that.
Actually, I really did, and I just want to add a footnote that I'm looking forward to both your books, and I will be reading your book, because I have a project coming up after that. I really want to look more into what that episode that you and Ben had together, some fascinating information on the paranormal in there. And I do want to say that I really appreciated your personal experience in this as well, so I do want that said. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thanks, mate.
Yeah.
Thank you, Randy.
Yeah, cool. Well, I've tried to put a lot of my personal experiences in the book, but I've had to kind of reshape them. I won't say much more than that. Re-edit them slightly to make them more appealing. Not appealing, palatable maybe? I don't know, but we all know why anyway. So anyway, this is the Paranormal Peep Show, giving thanks to Randy Walsh for his involvement with this evening. I hope you found it of interest, and feel free to leave comments on the YouTube channel and also on the MP3 version of the Paranormal Peep Show, which goes out on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. So this is myself, Neil Ward, and thanks to Ben Emlyn-Jones for joining us once more. And we'll see you soon on the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Good night.